Hello, so this video is aimed at providing you with a basic understanding of how ERD design works and what some of the things mean. So what is an entity relationship diagram? So an ERD is a type of structural diagram that shows how entities, for example people, objects or concepts, relate to each other. So this is essentially mapping out how a database will function and work, and how the tables will interact, essentially. So an ERD will use different symbols and connectors to visualize the connections of major entities. Relationships among these entities are represented, and their attributes. What does this all mean? So we have entities and attributes, and we also have relationships amongst those. We'll see how everything relates in the next couple of slides. Entities should be nouns and relationships are verbs. So the components and features of an ERD. So the first thing would obviously be the entity itself. So an entity is a definable thing. So it could be a person, object, concept or event which can have data stored about it. So what we refer to as tables, we refer to as entities when we map them out diagrammatically. So the attributes of that entity would be basically the properties and characteristics of that entity. So what goes into that table, what data goes in there. So an example of this would be ID and name and say email address, or a range, depending on the table, a range of different data and attributes can go in there. So we have a primary key, which is a special kind of attribute. It identifies the instance of the attribute in the entity uniquely. So it's a unique identifier within a entity, essentially. So every entity would have a primary key. We also have a foreign key, which is when we're using an entity within another entity. So when we have an entity that we want to refer to within an entity, so that would be a foreign key within a entity. So this will all make sense once we get some diagrams up here. So okay, so let's talk about notation styles briefly. So we have a range of different notation styles. The main one that is mostly used for engineering purposes and information systems is crow's foot, and that's the one we're going to be talking about. So what does this all mean? So the crow's foot notation shows us how the tables would look here. This would be the relationship. We'll go further into this in a second. So let's first talk about the different relationships here. So that we've got the one, we've got the many, we've got one and only one. So 0 or 1, 1 or many, 0 or many. In this case, one classroom, so because it's related to this side of the table, one classroom has many students. So from that example there we can see how this all works. So there's a relationship at either end of the table. So this table here, one classroom, would entail a lot of different students. So there'll be a lot of data entries for this student, and this is the attributes of that. So there'd be a lot of student entries for that classroom, and this could be for a range of reasons. We could be registering students in the classroom when they tap in or whatever, if this was a database for that specific purpose. So yeah, the most commonly used relationships is one, many, and these two here as well. So one or many, 0 or many. And as we can see here, that's how an entity is. So okay, so let's see what the different components are. As I've gone through them really quickly, so this would better show you what the different components are. So this is an entity. The entity name is represented at the top. So this is a student entity, which is a person. We've got the primary key of that table, which is the student ID. So this ID would, in a database, would gather all the table information because it's the primary key, and we would refer to this this whole table with the primary key. So everything in between that, after the primary key and including the primary key, is the attributes. So these are all the attributes of the table. These are all the attributes. So we have the first name, last name, email, student address, mobile number. This would be all information that would be in the table student. So visualizing the components, further on from that, we can see that we can have a foreign key. So when there's two tables, we can have a foreign key of student ID, and we can have a relationship between the tables. So this means, as I've said before, one classroom can have many students. So a foreign key, student ID is a foreign key in the classroom table. So when it's registered, the student ID would be a attribute inside the classroom and would be a data set. So all the student IDs that tap in, because one classroom can have many students, and that's the relationship. So one classroom has many students. So further on from that, we can see a more complex table where things are getting a bit more advanced. So the event, this is for a coursework that I had to do. So the event, we have a range of different different entities with attributes that relate to the event, and they use the same principles. The primary key, these are relationships amongst the tables, and it just gets more complex from the basic principles there. So all these tables were created using Lucid Chart, which is faster and easier than using Microsoft Visio, in my opinion. We can go into further detail about how these tables work and how you can split up tables as we've done here. So we've got an event supplier, which is another table. It has two primary keys, and then the supplier. So we've basically split up a table here for purposes of the coursework, and depending on the situation, you may need to or may not need to do that. I hope you've understood the basic principles of what goes into a ERD, but thank you for watching so far, and have a go at Lucid Chart if you want to create a table of your own. Thanks again.